What's up, everybody? John the Morgile here. Going to do a pretty quick flat Earth video for you guys. I hope you enjoy it. I want to give a big shout out and thanks to Jason in Michigan. So just want to start off by asking a couple of rhetorical questions. What does it mean to be at rest? Motionless, fixed, and immovable. According to the infinite space relativistic paradigm, to be completely motionless or at rest is utterly unachievable, as everything in the hypothetical cosmos is in constant mind-boggling motion around one imaginary mass or another. So to be at rest can only be relative to one frame of reference or another. For example, as you're sitting still in your chair right now, it may appear that you are at rest relative to the Earth. However, we're expected to believe that you're actually traveling faster than the speed of sound around a curve due to axial rotation, orbiting the Sun at 6,600 miles per hour on average along an imaginary curved orbital trajectory, simultaneously adhering to the Sun's fantastic velocity around the galactic center at a 60-degree angle to the hypothetical ecliptic plane, no less, at around 500,000 miles an hour, give or take, as the galaxy itself is supposedly speeding through the cosmos at some millions of miles per hour. So if one were to suddenly be truly at rest, the Earth, the solar system, the galaxy itself would appear to accelerate away from such an unlucky beholder in an instant. Modern hypothetical science holds that being at rest is merely a relative concept. So while two objects traveling at any speed through a vacuum may appear to be in motion according to quote-unquote stationary observers, said objects will be at rest according to one another, so long as their velocities remain similar, without any acceleration applied to either object. Now, this may seem theoretically cogent or doable at first. Closer inspection, as usual, yields major flaws in this concept. At least the globe Earth hypothetical applications of this principle are flawed interpretations of data in order to essentially twist observable reality into something which could hypothetically support a spinning ball Earth theoretically. So the big problem with objects in motion being at rest according to that reference frame, when you accelerate one of those objects in varying directions relative to that base velocity, it does introduce some interesting results as rules. So, for example, if two objects are moving from left to right through hypothetically, say, a vacuum, let's pretend it's a very long tubular vacuum chamber. If these two objects are moving at the same speed through this vacuum, they will apparently be stationary to one another. But if you were to somehow apply some force or some form of acceleration or pressure on the leading edge of one of those objects, it would accelerate from the other object more swiftly compared to if you were to apply a similar pressure or acceleration to the rear edge in accordance with that velocity. This is, of course, because objects traveling in contrary directions will have a higher relative speed or a higher difference in speed to one another compared to objects traveling in similar directions. So if you could somehow apply the exact same amount of force to one of these hypothetically moving objects in either direction to perform such an experiment, you would always find that it's easier to cause the objects to separate in space or accelerate away from one another by decelerating one object, so in the reverse of the trajectory, as opposed to accelerating that object in accordance with the trajectory. This is a natural physical law which can be demonstrated all day long in a lab or such experiments, unless you're talking about the hypothetical non-existing motion of the Earth, in which case it can never be demonstrated. So, for example, if you've ever ridden on a train, or if you ever get to ride a train one day, you'll find that it's much easier to walk from the front of a moving train towards the rear than it is to walk from the rear of the moving train towards the front. This is because all objects inherently want to remain at rest. Of course, it's claimed by ballers that being at rest, is indeed traveling along multiple curved linear paths at mind-boggling speeds. But when you realize that the Earth is indeed at complete rest, fixed and immovable, all objects indeed want to remain at rest, not relative to some hypothetical asinine motion of the Earth that doesn't exist, but in fact actually at rest. So when you're moving from the front of the train towards the rear of the moving train, say it's moving at 50 miles an hour, the physical matter of the train is racing towards your apparent path of motion, making every step a bit easier compared to going the other direction, especially if you take your feet off the ground completely at times. So like if you were to skip, say, from the front of the train towards the rear. Of course, I recommend doing such experiments with a friend who can attest to your sanity, and of course, on a train that is currently traveling in a straight line. This is because people might think you're crazy if you're skipping down the train, and of course, the latter would be because any curve or detouring from that straight line path of travel will be felt as an acceleration, which might cause you to like skip sideways into the wall, right? So such facts can always be demonstrated, unless, of course, you're talking about the hypothetical, non-existing axial rotation and orbital velocities of the Earth, which can, in fact, never be detected or measured and never needs to be accounted for when dealing with aircraft, artillery, and, yes, even long-range sniper shots. Of course, it's claimed by Globers that snipers must account for the imaginary Coriolis force. Notice they don't call it the imaginary spin of the Earth, but the Coriolis force. But snipers do not have to account for the spin of the Earth. It's claimed that snipers must account for the imaginary Coriolis force. But of course, if you read the Scout Sniper Manual, it's clearly talking about the Coriolis force upon the bullet itself, where the bullet is considered the rotating gyroscopic object traveling through varying atmosphere or temperatures over long distances, and is certainly not talking about the hypothetical imaginary spin of the Earth. So I think it's sort of naive to assume that snipers would need to account for the Coriolis force, but like people who fire artillery never account for that. Not to mention, nobody ever accounts for the curvature of the Earth either, and that applies to everything, engineers, architects, etc., because there is no curvature. But you can find videos online of drones being flown in the backs of like rental trucks, like U-Haul trucks and such. And this is often pointed to in order to support somehow the globe Earth theory and the ludicrous claims involving physical objects not obeying the rules of physical bodies in motion described a few minutes ago, but only when it comes to the hypothetical motion of the Earth. So if you get a truck up to a constant speed of, say, 25, with a drone and a pilot in the back at rest on the ground of the truck, when you launch the drone and the vehicle retains its course and speed without turning or accelerating, the drone will appear to be stationary relative to the truck. Of course, anytime the truck hits a bump in the road or takes a turn or any sort of acceleration away from that straight line velocity, the drone in flight will naturally not turn with the truck and will therefore begin to apparently accelerate towards either wall, and the flight of the drone will need to be corrected in order to remain in lockstep with the velocity of the truck. I think that a really interesting experiment, which isn't really necessary to do, but it would be nice to see like a drone flying to the rear of a moving train or maybe a large truck, and how that compares to the same drone flying from the rear to the front of the moving truck or train. Of course, again, there really is no need to get that fancy with the experiment, as anyone can simply walk briskly or skip towards the rear of a moving train, And the train will do half of the work, essentially, of apparently moving you towards the rear of itself, relative to the train, of course. On the other hand, when you walk from the front towards from the rear towards the front, then you must essentially race against the train, and it is therefore more difficult to walk from the rear towards the front of the train. Now, I submit that if your feet were not touching the ground, as in the case of a drone, this problem would be more exacerbated as when racing against the train or moving in the same direction with the train, so from the rear to the front. Such a drone would not have the luxury of the train physically moving it forward with every step, and when traveling in the contrary direction would not have the burden of the train physically pushing it in the wrong direction with every step. So really using a drone in a train would only prove this point further, I think. Again, and that point would be that it is easier to run or skip or walk from the front of the moving train to the rear compared to moving from the rear of that train to the front. And again, this is in response to the argument by Globbers that go something like, if you're in a moving car and you throw a ball back and forth to someone in that car, the ball doesn't shoot towards the rear of the car because everything's moving with the same frame of reference. And while that may be true, we're not talking about little short leaps of a ball where that forward momentum is retained. There's no acceleration away from that forward momentum. However, when you've got a drone or a jet airplane which is accelerating itself in directions contrary to the base frame of reference, then you do get different results relative when moving in different directions relative to that path of travel. So again, it's always easier to accelerate contrary to the path of travel. So you will accelerate away from any object faster if you go in the opposite direction of travel compared to if you try to accelerate one of those objects forward in the direction of travel. And that's always going to be the case except for when you're hypothetically dealing with the spinning ball Earth. Now, according to these basic physical laws, these immutable laws of nature, it definitely should be easier to walk or fly in a westerly direction, as the Earth is alleged to be spinning towards the east upon its axis. So, like, if you're doing an Olympic tryout for the long jump, I would suggest that if the Earth were a spinning ball, it would be much easier to jump further as long as you're jumping towards the west. If you were jumping towards the east, you'd have to sort of race against and jump against the velocity of the Earth. And if you were north to south, and that would cause side-to-side or lateral problems with your trajectory. That really is what we should see, but in fact, that's not what we see. It doesn't matter which direction you run or jump or fly. The duration is always the same, depending on atmospheric or weather conditions, the winds at the time, right? But so according to these basic physical laws, if the Earth were a sphere spinning around on an axis, it should be easier to walk or fly in a westerly direction, as the Earth and all the destinations are alleged to be spinning east towards you against that velocity at all times. Of course, when you begin to figure in the hypothetical non-existing orbit of the Earth around the Sun, one's overall direction through space relative to their current position on the Earth and direction of travel in terms of the spin would depend on the time of day. So at midnight, the Earth would be under your feet going that way, and at noon, the Earth would be moving under your feet going that way, and it would be constantly changing between those two extremes. When the sun rises, the Earth should be racing up towards your feet at 6,600 miles an hour, and at sunset, the Earth should be racing down away from your feet at 6,600 miles an hour. So over a 12-hour period, we should experience a total acceleration of over 130,000 miles an hour. Yet nobody's ever measured or detected that. And in between those 12-hour periods, you'd have a phase shift in your inertial reference frame to that of the direction of the Earth, a full 180 degrees over 12 hours. So we should constantly be experiencing acceleration on the spinning ball Earth, but we never experience any acceleration because the Earth is in fact stationary. And of course, we can clearly see that the Earth is completely at rest. And the fact that objects tend to remain at rest unless excited or accelerated in some way could simply not be possible upon a twirling and orbiting spherical Earth. This would be owing to the alleged curvilinear nature of each path, be it axial rotation or orbit, which means acceleration would be inherent in this motion. Angular acceleration would be applied to any observer on such a spinning and orbiting sphere, constantly changing throughout every day and night as the faster than sound spin of the Earth phases us with a constantly different alignment to that 666 miles per hour orbit of the Earth, necessarily creating centrifugal force or angular acceleration to be applied to any observer constantly at varying degrees throughout the course of any 24-hour period. The fact that no one has ever detected, measured, or recorded such necessary acceleration on the spinning ball Earth is somehow overlooked by all of science. This is clearly not because the spinning ball Earth should be exempt from physical laws which disagree with the theory, but because everyone is convinced at a very young age to believe in the spinning ball Earth as a 100% fact which must never be questioned or even examined skeptically. In fact, this case in point here demonstrates nicely how demonstrable, repeatable laws of physics are completely abandoned in favor of the globe Earth theory. Yet those who are participating in such cognitive dissonance are, I believe, completely unaware that they are perpetuating a total fallacy. So, for example, based on the fundamental law of physical reality, which proves that objects traveling in opposite directions will always have a higher relative difference in speed compared to objects traveling in similar directions, this fact is abandoned every single day by those arguing for the globe Earth. By all that is rational and demonstrable, a westbound flight should certainly be easier to achieve than an eastbound flight, since the Earth and all destinations are allegedly in constant motion east over 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, and faster than the speed of sound in most places in the U.S. hypothetically. Of course, many such flights will be similar or even identical in duration, which is a big, huge problem for the theory of a spinning ball Earth. You see, the first argument which will be presented to this fact in terms of westbound flights often being similar or identical in duration to their respective eastbound flights, the first argument which is typically presented is the argument that since the planes are traveling with the Earth's velocity prior to takeoff, therefore the planes will continue to travel with the Earth's axial rotational velocity for the duration of the flight. This is, of course, absolutely ridiculous for a number of reasons. However, it makes perfect sense only if you start with the foundational belief that the Earth must be a spinning ball no matter what. For one of the fundamental laws of motion is essentially that objects in motion will tend to maintain their velocity unless enacted upon by some other force. So while the experiment involving two objects moving through a vacuum chamber earlier would not be possible in reality, since all objects do tend to fall towards the ground, so you couldn't keep them going in a rectilinear path for very long, it would be theoretically possible if you could remove the effect of objects tending towards the ground and, of course, remove the atmosphere as you do in a vacuum chamber. But we can certainly consider several jet engines attached to the plane as some other force. And it's utterly ridiculous to claim that an airplane will continue traveling east with the spin of the Earth Even when jet engines are accelerating that plane with millions of pounds of thrust in the opposite direction, um, this is just ridiculous. It's equally ridiculous due to the fact that the Earth and destinations are not supposedly traveling in straight line paths, but are instead supposedly traveling along a curved path, which clearly would not be applied to the jet airplane thousands of feet removed from the ground. The simple fact is, a westbound plane should be traveling towards destinations which are also racing towards themselves, meaning westbound planes or westbound flights would be much shorter in duration if the world was actually traveling in an eastward motion around a singular axis. Now, once it's made clear, if the Glober will even give you this much time or attention, once it's made clear that the initial reference frame of the spinning ball Earth would simply not be retained by aircraft accelerated in the opposite direction as the spin, and landing an airplane would be impossible on anything but a perfectly aligned east to west runway if the Earth was indeed spinning on a north to south axis. The next argument is invariably that the atmosphere is somehow effectively carried along with the ground, somehow, eternally matching the velocity of the spinning ground beneath itself. So while the westbound flight would indeed be shorter within a vacuum, they would say, the atmosphere of the Earth, in fact, carries the plane along with it towards the east as the plane swims through the matrix of the atmosphere that is always tattooed in lockstep with the ground beneath it. Now, of course, this entire argument is also preposterous, as it presupposes that the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what, and so no thought whatsoever is put into whether or not such claims are in line with observable physics and observable reality. In fact, such claims are shown to be absurd for multiple reasons. For one, jet airplanes are specifically designed to be aerodynamic, so their designs are made to decrease the effect that the atmosphere has on hindering its trajectory. And of course, a lot of designs go into increasing thrust. So increasing thrust, reducing drag, that's aerodynamics. And the whole purpose of aerodynamics is to cut through the atmosphere. So while the ambient background velocity of the atmosphere does indeed have an effect on an airplane's ground speed, winds in no way inherently govern the ability of the jet to traverse relative to the ground. But beyond this point, I would submit that the basis for their entire argument here is unfounded, as you simply could not have winds which can reach hundreds of miles an hour at certain altitudes if in fact the atmosphere were beholden to or stuck to the frame of reference with the ground beneath it. In fact, we can see many cases in nature where one layer of clouds are traveling in one direction, while another layer of clouds are traveling in the opposite direction. So how is such a thing possible if the atmosphere is always traveling east with the hypothetical non-existing velocity of the Earth spin? Furthermore, if the atmosphere were always traveling east with the hypothetical non-existing velocity of the Earth spin, then any westbound plane should deal with major headwinds as a rule. All eastbound planes would enjoy tailwinds as a rule. Northbound planes would experience portside winds as a rule, and southbound planes would have winds upon the starboard as a rule. The simple truth is, the Earth is at rest, and the winds aloft are in motion above and around the stationary plane Earth. Immutable facts of nature must be overlooked and abandoned and ignored in order to continue believing in a spinning globe Earth. While it should indeed be easier to jog or take a running jump towards the west, assuming a spinning ball Earth, the fact is, it is equally easy to jog or jump in any direction, and regardless of which direction you jump, it's irrelevant. Yet, the globe Earth narrative somehow contorts this into evidence for a spinning ball Earth, which is amazing. It really is amazing. The way that they do this is to begin with the foregone conclusion, of course, that the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what, and then begin to analyze the evidence through that lens and only through that lens. So, for example, the fact that westbound flights are not much shorter in duration as a rule compared to their respective eastbound flights, that is considered to be inconsequential, as the Earth will be a spinning ball no matter what, and therefore such things must be compatible with the spinning ball Earth. And furthermore, this impossibility on a spinning ball is now morphed into proof of a spinning ball, which is just crazy. Of course, if one takes a moment to consider the possibility that the world might actually be stationary, such problems are indeed solved instantly, without effort, without any need for hypothetical acrobatics, and indeed the notion of a spinning ball Earth becomes inherently absurd. Since we know that immutable physical laws of nature must apply to the Earth, this renders these facts as good evidence that the Earth is not in motion whatsoever. Only in one's imagination could the Earth hypothetically be a spinning ball, and only if one refuses to question the underlying assumption that the Earth must be a spinning ball flying through infinite space no matter what, in spite of multiple immutable physical laws which disagree with the theory. That's the only way that you can continue believing in the ball Earth, is if you just shut down your senses, disagree with observable, immutable laws of reality, and hold to beliefs that were implanted into our subconscious minds as children, gullible toddlers, basically. So with that, I hope that I got the message out that I wanted to convey through this video. If you would like to support this channel, you can make a one-time contribution through PayPal to www.paypal.me/themorguile, or a recurring monthly contribution for as little as $1 a month through Patreon at www.patreon.com/themorguile. So with that, thanks so much for watching, you guys. God bless, and spread the word, spread the world, and peace out, everybody.
Make the earth shake. Make the earth shake. Rock on. Make the earth shake. Make the earth shake.